of the commute blad letter was seating. In the festity, Aquilance in his new history bombed is off. Zagarid, the pit whatever regulate, with year had babine with a 200 slint. If it sees hit or rate on opits breedling, was the canana unita was might. Where the real, over issue. Was there lies tea and other the ICV random, and stone some instrudy and will come up. I'm 30 other men admit, 5 just here with the 9 Angelus was by accident. And of those 900 men, only 316 were still alive. This is the worst shark attack in recorded history. And the strangest part is what the Navy did to the one man who survived being in command. To understand how it happened, you have to go back 2 weeks to a mission so secret, most of the crew never knew what they were carrying. In mid-July 1945, the Indianapolis was ordered to race across the Pacific at record speed. San Francisco to the island of Tinian, unescorted, faster than she had ever moved. In her hold were crates the crew were told not to touch, and bolted to the floor of the captain's own cabin was a lead-lined bucket guarded around the clock. Inside it was the enriched uranium core of Little Boy, the first atomic bomb. The Indianapolis was carrying the components that, days later, would be dropped on Hiroshima. She delivered her cargo on the 26th of July. The most important secret payload of the entire war was off her decks. Her job was done. And that is the cruel irony of this story. The Indianapolis survived the most dangerous cargo imaginable. It was the empty trip home that killed her. Just after midnight on the 30th of July, the Japanese submarine I-58 spotted a large ship crossing the calm, moonlit sea. Her commander, Mochitsura Hashimoto, fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 struck home. 1 blowing off the bow, 1 hitting amidships near the fuel tanks and a magazine. The Indianapolis was top-heavy from years of added guns and armor. She rolled hard, her bow plowing under. There was no time to organize, no time to launch most of the boats. Many men never even reached a life jacket. 12 minutes. That is how long it took a 10,000-ton warship to disappear. Around 300 men went down with her, and the 900 left floating in the oil and the dark assumed the same thing every sailor assumes, that someone knew. That help was already coming. Nobody was coming. Here is the failure that turned a tragedy into a catastrophe. The Indianapolis had been due at Leyte on the 31st of July. She never arrived. And when a warship carrying more than 1,000 men simply doesn't turn up, nothing happened. Under the system at the time, the arrival of a ship that big was just assumed. When she didn't appear, one board marked her as arrived. Another quietly removed her from the plot. The officer who noticed she was overdue decided it wasn't his job to report it and said nothing. So for 4 days, the most powerful navy on Earth had no idea that one of its cruisers was at the bottom of the ocean and its crew was dying in the water. Distress calls had been sent as she went down. The Navy would later claim none were ever confirmed received. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Total silence. The men in the water were on their own. That first night, the survivors did what they could. They lashed themselves together in groups, some in the handful of rafts, most just in life jackets, floating inlet in a slick of black fuel oil that burned their eyes and coated their throats. They were burned by the sun by day and shaking with cold by night. They had almost no fresh water. The oil made them vomit, and the salt water began to eat at their skin. But they held on because rescue had to be coming. They told each other it would be tomorrow. And then, as the sun rose on that first morning, They saw the fins. The sharks had been there since the sinking, feeding on the dead. They were mostly oceanic whitetips, a species that lives far out in open ocean and that follows the sound of a disaster. Possibly tiger sharks, too. Drawn by the explosions, the thrashing, the blood, and hundreds of struggling men, they gathered in numbers no one had ever witnessed. At first, they took the bodies. Then they began to take the living. Survivors described it in the same way. Voyage. A green, a scream, a man militant, a patch of red spreading water where one had been a moment before. It came without warning, and it came again and again for days. The men learned that the splashing of a dying or panicking sailor drew the sharks in, so they faced an impossible choice. Push away the weakest men to save the group, or hold them close and bring the sharks to everyone. Exposure and thirst killed the most, but it was the sharks that made those 5 days a nightmare beyond anything in the war. This remains, to this day, the worst shark attack ever recorded. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. They were not found because anyone was looking for them. They were found by pure chance. On the 4th day, a Navy patrol plane, a Ventura on a routine flight, hunting submarines, happened to pass overhead. The pilot glanced down and saw something strange, a long, dark oil slick and specks in the water. Men. He radioed it in. A flying boat piloted by a lieutenant named Adrian Marks flew to the scene, and what its crew saw below broke every rule they had. Marks landed his aircraft on the open ocean, something it was never designed to do, and began pulling dying men out of the water and lashing them to the wings. That night, the destroyer USS Cecil Doyle arrived and pointed its searchlight straight up into the dark, against orders, as a beacon, telling the men still floating out there that after 5 days, someone had finally come. Of the roughly 900 who went into the water, 316 came out alive. Now the story should end with grief and relief. Instead, the Navy did something it had never done before and has never done since. It put the survivor in command on trial. Captain Charles McVeigh had commanded the Indianapolis through years of combat. He was one of the last men off the sinking ship, and he was pulled from the water with his crew. Weeks later, he was court-martialed, charged, in effect, with losing his own ship. He was convicted of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag, failing to steer an evasive zigzag course that night. But the case was rotten. McVeigh had been told to zigzag only at his discretion, weather permitting, and he had not been warned that a Japanese submarine was known to be operating directly across his route. The Navy had sent him, unescorted and uninformed, into danger. And then, in the most extraordinary moment of the trial, the Navy flew in a witness for the prosecution, Mochitsura Hashimoto, the enemy commander who had sunk the ship. Even he testified that zigzagging would have made no difference. He would have sunk her anyway. McVeigh was convicted regardless. He was the only captain in the entire Second World War to be court-martialed for losing his ship to an act of war. His sentence was quietly set aside, and he stayed in the Navy and retired an admiral. But the conviction stayed on his record, and something worse followed him home. For years, McVeigh received letters from the families of the men who had died. Some of them were unspeakable. One read, "Merry Christmas holiday would be a lot merrier if you hadn't killed my son." His own crew, the men who had been in that water with him, defended him for the rest of their lives. They said, again and again, that it was not his fault. It wasn't enough. In 1968, more than 20 years after the sinking, Charles McVeigh walked out onto his front lawn and took his own life. He was 70 years old. He was found holding a small toy sailor he had carried since childhood. And that is where the story sat for another 3 decades. Until a 12-year-old boy watched a film about a sinking ship and refused to let it go. In 1996, a sixth grader named Hunter Scott started on the School History Project, USS Indianapolis. He tracked down and interviewed nearly 150 survivors, and the more he learned, the more certain he became that a terrible injustice had never been put right. His project became national news. It reached survivors, then a submarine captain who proved mathematically that zigzagging could never have saved the ship, then a United States senator. In the year 2000, 55 years after the sinking, and 32 years after McVeigh's death, Congress passed a resolution formally exonerating Captain Charles McVeigh. It noted the plain, damning fact: hundreds of Navy ships were lost in the war, and he was the only captain ever put on trial for it. A 12-year-old with a history assignment had cleared the name the entire Navy had refused to. The USS Indianapolis carried the weapon that ended the war and was sunk on the empty voyage home. Her men survived 12 minutes of fire and 5 days of sharks, only to be forgotten in the water, and then again on dry land. They were failed at almost every turn, but they were never forgotten by each other. And in the end, that is what finally set the record straight. Subscribe to Forgotten Frontlines for the WWII stories history left half told. Share this one with the history buffs in your life. Follow for more forgotten history.